This is the program input loops break continue.cpp on your Canvas page. So we're going to discuss three different kinds of loops, and then we'll discuss how to use control and break to give us even more flexibility within a counter control loop. So let me go ahead and run this program, and then we'll go through the output as we go through the program. So with this program, we've got include IOStream and CMath, and it's basically just going to take some data from the keyboard, and then it'll compute a sum. So the first type of loop would be a counter control loop. So we're going to use a counter to determine how many lines of data we're going to read. So we have to know in advance how many lines of data. So this program here is prompting the user for the lines of data. This is the statement here, 18. So if we type in a 3, that 3 is going to be stored in numdat. This is going to now zero out the sum. And now we're inside the for loop here. So the for loop is going to go from 0 up to numdat. So we gave it a value of 3. So this for loop will run for I is equal to 0, run again for I is equal to 1, and then run again for I is equal to 2. At I is equal to 3, it'll fail the test, and then it'll continue with the rest of the program. So we gave it 3 lines of data, so it'll run 3 times. So if we type in 1.23, 2.34, 3.45, it's executing lines 28 and 29 the 3 times. And so it created that and gave a sum, and the sum is getting printed out here on line 34. So that would be our first loop, our counter control loop, and you can use that for loop. The for loop's probably the easiest type of loop to implement, like we discussed previously. And so you can use this kind of loop when you know exactly how many data points you want to enter. Let's say that you have a loop though, and the user's going to be entering data, and you don't know how many data points the user's going to enter. One option is what's called a Sentinel controlled loop. So our Sentinel is going to be this value, negative 999. When the negative 999 is entered, that'll trigger to exit the loop. So let's see how this loop is set up. We're going to have to read in one initial value, so that line 47 is reading in one initial value into dat. So let's type in 1.23, that goes into dat. Now we go into our while loop, so line 48. This looks kind of odd, but all this is doing is it's checking to see if we entered negative 999. Remember, we talked way back at the beginning about how floating point numbers, so that's float and double, are not always represented with all of their digits in binary. And so if we have that loss of digits, we don't want to check to see if dat is equivalent to negative 999. Instead, what we want to check is if dat is close to negative 999. So we take dat, we add 999 to it. We should get a 0 if it was negative 999. And then we just check to see if that value is above some small threshold value. So in this case, 1 times 10 to the minus 4. The e in small lowercase e in C++ just represents the times 10 raised to the power of. So let's do our other numbers. So we did 2.34. Now we're at line 52. So it checked, and 2.34 was not equal to negative 999. So we added it to the sum. We incremented the number of data points again. Now we're at line 52 again. And we'll do 3.45, and it did the same thing, added that to the sum, incremented the number of data points. Now we're at line 52 again. So if we now enter negative 999, it goes up, and then it fails this test. So it's not above our threshold value for the difference. Notice also, I forgot to mention earlier, we're using an absolute value function, and that's just eliminating any positive or negative sign, making it be positive. So The next option would be if we're going to read until there's no more data to read. Now with keyboard input, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. But we're going to do these same 3 loops again, but with looking at files next week. And so it makes kind of sense to talk about it now, and then we'll see it again next week with reading from files. So we can trigger an end of data if we use a Control-Z for some of your IDEs and a Control-D for some of the others. So with code blocks, it's going to be a Control-Z. So with this loop, what it's doing is it's looking at CN. So we have while the exclamation point says not, cn dot EOF open close parentheses. So EOF stands for end of file. So we're checking to see if CN has reached the end of file. And again, we're just triggering that with a Control-D or a Control-Z. So this statement, when CN is at the end of file, it's going to return a true. When it's not at the end of file, that means when it's still available for reading more data, it's going to return a false. But we want our while loop to go when whatever's in parentheses here is true, and we want our while loop to stop when whatever in parentheses here is false. So we need to stick a not statement in front of that. So that's our exclamation point. So this is when it's not at end of file, continue reading, and then once it hits end of file and that becomes true, then we're taking the not of that, so it's false, and then we'll drop out of the while loop. So let's do our same 3 numbers. And then after this last number, I'm going to do a Control-Z and then press enter. So it triggered our end of file, and then it summed it up. Now we can do a loop that's kind of a hybrid of everything that we've done so far, but we're going to use a for loop because we're going to give it the number of lines of data to read. So I'm going to say that we're going to read 5, and then we're going to exit this one early. So we can now enter data, and we're going to do 2 things now in our for loop that are different. The first is just to demonstrate an if statement that'll allow you to skip the rest of the for loop. So in this case, if we enter a number greater than 100, let's say that for some reason we want to ignore that number, we can do if dat is greater than 100, then we go to continue. So continue is going to just finish the for loop without looking at any of these other statements, go back up, increment I, test it, and then go through the for loop again. So continue just stops where you are, but it sends you back through the loop again. So let's try that. So we'll do 1.23, and then we'll do 123, and then we'll do 2.34, and 3.45. Now we want to exit this loop early because we realized, hey, we don't really have 5 data points to type in. We can do that with the second part. So just like with our while loop, we check to see if the absolute value of dat plus 999 was greater than or less than 1 times 10 to the minus 4. We can check to see if the absolute value is less than our threshold value. If it is, then we're going to do a break command. So we saw break before when we were working with switch, and it has the same function here. So remember, in the switch, when you encountered the break, it took you out of the switch statement and it didn't execute any of the other cases below the break. It's going to do the same thing here. Once we hit the break, then it's going to exit this for loop, so it's never going to see line 124. So we entered 4 numbers, so it counted this number because it got counted by I, and we stored I in numdat so that we would have a record of it after the loop ended. But notice that it never summed up the 123. That's because when we hit the continue, line 124 didn't get executed. And then notice that we exited the loop early by going through and entering that value that broke us out of the loop. And by exiting the loop early, because we broke out of the loop here, we never did line 124 with that last number, the negative 999. And that's it. So that gives you an example of the three main types of loops that we're going to use for input, both keyboard input and file input. And then that also gives you an example of using continue and break with the loop. Be very careful though when you're using continue and break. There are times when you may need to use it, but for the most part, if there's another way that you can do your loop so that you don't have to use a continue or a break, that's probably a better way to set up your loop. The problem with the continue and the break is you can see how confusing it is that part of your loop never gets executed with the continue, and then you can see how it looks like your loop is going to execute this many times, but then with the break it comes out. So imagine if you had a really large for loop that had a large body of statements, and then you had a break somewhere in there. If your program was doing something that you didn't want it to do and you had a runtime error because of the break, it might make it very difficult to find and debug it. So use these very sparingly and make for sure that you comment your use of them in a program, and you might even want to put a comment up here in your for loop that you have a break or continue in there, just to help if another person's ever running your code, or if you're running your code 6 months later. Well, thanks for watching.